Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for your time. I'm hoping that the technical elements will work with this presentation. But please give me a shout if they don't. So greetings everybody. It is such a pleasure to be with you today. And as Caitlin said, my name is Rachael Minott, and I'm the Inclusion and Change Manager at the National Archives, and also a board member and the chair of the Decolonizing Guidance Working Group for the Museum Association, as well as being a freelance curator, a researcher, and an artist. Those may seem to be fairly disparate pursuits, but my art practice has always been an output of archival and museum research and explorations into the difference between representing other people's stories versus self-representation. I'm really hoping that what I have today will be of use to you. I'm interested to know when you get past this sense of imposter syndrome, because I feel that's here after listening to such wonderful speakers throughout today, noticing a spelling error on my own presentation. So many things can bring that up, but I'm hoping that I will be able to offer some wisdom through my personal journey, which I guess is what we all look for in history and art history. So in my role, both within the National Archives and the Museum Association, I'm exploring barriers to access to heritage and what leads to these barriers, how to dismantle them, and how to work towards the end of marginalization in spaces of communal memory. It is a ridiculously optimistic undertaking that requires critical head, emotional intelligence, communication skills, and collaboration. All skills I firmly believe I developed through my training as an artist and as an art historian, and later by studying anthropology. So I'll briefly run through my previous training and some of my previous roles, and I want to focus in on shared themes and seminal moments in the hopes that somewhere in my experience, there are things that can be in turn useful advice and potential insight. So there are a few recurrent themes throughout my career so far, and I want to use these to structure my thinking and sharing. I'll be using them to group experiences together, so I won't be running through my career history in a chronological order, but I will be trying to keep a sense of time and place intact. The images that I share have dates, so that will help, and I will try to allude to work that might have been doing concurrently, subsequently, or which preceded each. So the first of the themes that I want to explore are critical engagement and creativity. And I want to look at these through the lens of my art practice. These have been essential skills that have grounded my practice, but have actually filtered across everything that I have done within the museum and cultural sector. So my undergraduate degree was in art practice and a history of art joint degree from the University of Reading. My practice there was focused on exploring representation of Jamaica. Through it, I created a fake institution, the International Gallery of Jamaica, that was a custodian of the collection of Jamaican historical artworks that I had created, that responded to or could be used to tell the history of Jamaica. And the idea is that this collection was made by Jamaicans who were experiencing this history as contemporaries. So I created fake biographies for these people. I created fake object biographies for the artworks that I created. And then I staged real events and exhibitions where I invited academics to come and share their practice and thinking around Jamaica. I exhibited my work both in my final exhibition, which I'll show in a second, as well as in the Reading Museum with support by one of their curators. And that's what this picture depicts here. So this is Reading Museum, as I said, and I did a photo shoot with my artwork throughout the museum, helped by the curator, to explore how the pieces that were on display in the museums created different and new context to the pieces that I was making. I wanted to understand this idea of how context changed interpretation, but also the difference between the histories and people that were being represented in these spaces of communal learning. So this is my final degree show image, which included a film of a conference that I staged to provide some historical context to my work for those who were experiencing it without any familiarity. I was very aware that while I was intimately connected to Jamaica, many other people didn't know much about the history or context beyond the stereotypes and holidays and imagery that permeated popular culture. So I didn't really want my artwork to create this sense of othering my own culture. So I really wanted it to be truly a space for sharing and exploring representation and the idea of self-representation. And look, it's me. So I was fortunate enough at the end of my degree show to be awarded a prize based on that degree show. And this prize was to have your own solo exhibition at Modern Art Oxford and to be entered into a further prize as part of the Platform Award for Art. I was doing this simultaneously to having gained a successful application to intern at Reading Museum after I had worked with the curator to create this photo shoot for my artwork. And so I concurrently began planning the solo exhibition while conducting research into the missionary collections at Reading Museum and how they impacted Reading Museum's collection and the representation of the world and Reading's place within it. So I chose to connect the two, and I was able to borrow missionary objects from the museum to be displayed alongside my work. And my work that I created for this exhibition delved much deeper into the role of Baptist missionaries in Jamaican history. And so I focused on 3 Baptist Jamaican figures, Sam Sharp, Paul Bogle, and George William Gordon. And I contacted the Jamaican Baptist Society in England and connected with the Angus Library and Archives to host an event that would act as providing further context to this blending of religion and colonial context. The archive inclusion in this work created something that was a true highlight for me and extraordinarily unexpected, in that the archivist brought along the original Declaration of Emancipation to be shown alongside my work. So that's a picture there. So I guess a top tip here is to look for connections that allow you to create deeper context. Don't be afraid to contact people out of the blue, as we've heard throughout the day, for opportunities, and be open to the unexpected. When you bring projects and people together with different focuses, something new is made, and it can be really interesting. It can be very difficult. And sometimes you do have people saying no for multiple reasons. Some of these may be structural inequalities. Some of these may just be around individuals' priorities, and that being able to weather the no's is also an important part of reaching out to strangers. But this theme of creative collaboration continued through my practice, leading me to apply for the Ghetto Biennale in Haiti with my colleague and from my undergraduate degree, Gabrielle Gilmore. Together, we combined our practices, hers of exploring lost geographical and architectural sacred spaces, and mine in exploring self-representation and loss. We created, through our practice, a scaled version of the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Port-au-Prince that had been destroyed for the 7th time in 2010 during the earthquake. The preceding times were through religious wars. The cathedral housed many Haitian masterpieces that were representing Bible narratives, and they used Black figures and voodoo imagery to tell this story. So I was really fascinated by it. And in this work, I connected with the artist Gurley Laurent, and we collaboratively painted, repainted and remade the artworks from that cathedral in quite an interesting version of collaboration, where he would literally pluck the paintbrush out of my hand and start painting when it was my turn. It was exceptionally interesting experience. There we are all there together in the unfinished version of the painting, of the piece. So being in the Caribbean, but not at home, and seeing some of the very colonial behaviors, structures, and patterns replicated changed my perspective on my work as well. And it inspired me to submit a piece for the Jamaica Biennale. This piece. This is Jamaica Choosing Its Lover, which again, I was able to match up a lot of my practices, my varied practices at the same time. And I was able to go to Jamaica to take part in the Biennale events, whilst I was also in the island to research. So I needed to conduct some research for a master's dissertation, which was on Jamaican national representation. And I went to the National Library and I went to the National Gallery, and I looked into their archives. This kind of convergence of reasons to be there and hats to wear allowed me to experience these spaces in multiple ways, as a visiting student researcher, as a participant artist, and also with my family members as gatekeeping these spaces myself. It's a picture of me and my cousin seeing the painting together. It's very exciting. It would be about 2 years before I made art after that moment. And I did that by deciding to challenge myself and create some momentum by renting the space at Wilson Gallery and working with a colleague, friend, and curator to reflect on my practice. The collection I begun to personally amass, which a lot of it came from my family, but other Jamaican artists and Haitian artists. And I wanted to collaborate, bring it all together in the exhibition, thinking about Jamaica, because I realized that that's what I was doing. I might not have been making art all the time, but I was always thinking about Jamaica. I was writing about Jamaica. I was looking at the history of Jamaica. And it was since this moment and since that clarity that my art practice was a part of my thinking, that I have begun to use this art practice in this way. So my public speaking events since then have been a lot more creative. They have felt a lot more like spoken word pieces. And I've really championed the role of creativity in decolonial work, where we all need to reimagine the systems within which we work and function and how they could be made anew in an equitable and functional way. So this was actually the main painting that I did for this exhibition, which was a sister piece to Jamaica choosing its lover, which is Jamaica No Forget Your Motto. And there I am again. I've interspersed these personal pictures because I have a lot of time for being really using documentation, and it's really important if you are a practicing artist to remember to do great documentation, photographs of your work. But the reality is always more these sorts of Instagram snaps with your friends and family, and that's the emotional connection. So I'm just putting those in because they mean a lot to me. So parking my practice for a little bit, I want to in tune with the themes, this idea of these themes that are present throughout my experiences so far. And this time the themes are collaboration and co-creation. And this is really about your peers and the networks that you have. So I have been fortunate enough to find a number of networks that I can use to receive and give support throughout my practice. The Platform Award for Art, the prize I gained through my undergraduate degree, created and gave me links into an artistic network where even the assessors of the prize have become colleagues, in which I've been able to use as a touchstone for change and growth over the years. So these are two images. One is 2014 and the other is 2019. And we've been able to engage in these dialogues throughout this time, which has been extremely useful. After my internship at Reading Museum, I applied for and was successful in receiving a traineeship as a part of the National Lottery Heritage Funded Program, Sharing Our Cultural Life, shortened to SOCL 3. It was then called HLF. And it was run by what is now called Cultural And. Everything has changed in this time, but these people have remained steady. This was a year-long traineeship, which encouraged reciprocal visits and trainees across the divergent programs. So the trainees were across England in different institutions, were invited to do coaching sessions together and to remain as a part of this network. The traineeship had a lofty aim of each trainee changing the organization in which they were placed to make it more diverse and more inclusive. And that came with a lot of problems, and I'm happy to speak about that later. But the thing that did stay the same was this group of people. So I learned a lot from the year-long work experience, and that was invaluable to get through. And it was a paid traineeship. It was a poorly paid traineeship, but it was a paid traineeship. And my internship before was paid. I do think it's important to know when people have been paid or not paid for their time. So the work experience was great. The pay was useful, but it was these colleagues who really made it a useful experience, but have since then been touchstones, and people that I have collaborated with since and continue to collaborate with today. So Shasti Lotan, who curated my individual exhibition, she's one of this cohort, and I'm working with two of the cohorts in my work with the Museum Association currently. And also shout out to Chiedza, who's listening today. Thanks for the support. So again, it's important to think about the people that you're working with at all times, because they bring with them such a mass of valuable life experiences, different to you, but also in these moments like these art prizes or your traineeships or your studying, you've got a group of people with a lot of different backgrounds who are all thinking around the same topic as you, same kind of ideas, same discipline, same practice. And it's rare to find that again. And so, really value those networks that you have now and you'll continue to have, and nurture them. So through my master's course, which I did after I came back from Haiti, which was Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas at the University of East Anglia, studying at the Sainsbury Center for Visual Arts, I created within that cohort a really strong group of people who supported my practice and helped to challenge my critical thinking, my academic research in a way that hasn't been challenged since, if I'm honest. It's very different when you're writing papers that will be graded versus writing papers that will just be edited. There's a lot more forgiveness in the editing process than the grading process. So it's a different experience. But in regards to my career, the network which has had so many crossovers and has such a big impact on my life has been Museum Detox, which has become such an important touchstone for conversations, connections, collaborations, and exchange in the museum world specifically. It started out about creating a space where people of color in museum spaces were not the few, but the many, where we could interrogate the colonial legacies, the race, the racism, and how these systems affect us often in seemingly mundane ways, and in this kind of microcosmic, microaggressive way that's really difficult to communicate and really laborious to communicate to those who don't experience it themselves. It's a solution-oriented space, and it really showed me what we're really trying to foster in all of this. And it's not diversity, it's belonging. But how do we achieve that? So it's coming to the third and final grouping of themes that I want to work with, and that's communication, translation, and transparency. And this is around displays, documentation, and presentations. So two words that have dominated my career so far are diversity and decolonizing. Both words are very large, full of possibilities, as well as difficulties. Diversity, while truly a utopian lens on who manages, contributes to, and consumes art and history, is often framed as starting off from a point of whiteness and then adding color. This comes with the assumption that the initial frame that we work in and operate within can mostly stay the same as long as different people from different backgrounds now feel able to engage in the system and flourish within it. Decolonial lens problematizes the systems and says that within a colonial system, those who are marginalized can never truly flourish or feel as though they belong. They will eventually bend to match the system through assimilation, or they will break and leave the system, returning to the margins. Decolonial practice demands that we change the broken systems. Again, though a critical framework, this is still a utopian concept that asks us to reimagine the world without isms and schisms. The issue is, how do you start when our current reality relies on these structures to function and is so unequal that it frames the haves and the have-nots as opposing forces existing in parallel systems that need not connect and appear immeasurably apart? I think this is true for a lot of how our world is framed today, not just with a decolonial lens, but also the kind of polarization we're seeing in many different forms. The key to me is communication, translation, and transparency. Communicating different lived experiences, different ways of working, being transparent about where and when decisions are made, when funding is allocated and people are selected to do work. It is about translating what may seem like polarized views and experiences to understand the values that drive and motivate us, the triggers that we all experience, etc. So 3 ways I've tried to explore this through my practice. I will be focusing on these sorts of displays. So this one was a Past Is Now, Birmingham, the British Empire in 2017. This was a co-curated display working with 5 self-identified activists working in Birmingham. And the aim of the exhibition was to reach a BAME audience. Now, I don't like that word anymore, but it was what it was at the time, under 40, as a core audience. So one thing you'll find when you work in museums, or if you work in museums, or if you have worked in museums, a lot of time there's this framing of core audience and then like additional audiences. And when we come to this idea of risk and marginalization, this is, to me, where the core problem is. So the idea was to subvert that, to take people who aren't normally seen as a core audience and centralize them. The exhibition crammed a whole lot of content into one space, a lot of really beautiful art that you could argue wasn't given the space to be an independent piece of art on its own. So we used the salon hang to explore this idea of representation and self-representation. So everything on the back wall has a depiction of a person of color, and some of the artists are themselves people of color, and some of them are not. It was exploring the difference between this romanticized version of imagery and this idea of intimacy, real intimacy. We made a point of not putting any upsetting images of people of color or racist images of people of color on that wall. There was one small kind of cartoon that was in another part of the display to reframe someone who was depicted as the mayor of Birmingham, Joseph Chamberlain, and kind of held up in this sort of civic imagery throughout the rest of the museum with these grand portraits. And we wanted to reframe him as a colonial secretary and his part in the Boer War, and also the fact that he was documented and evidently a racist. And so we used that image only in that area. But we wanted the space to really feel like it was for people of color predominantly. So we also included these quotes on the wall on either side. There were 4 quotes. We had one from Joseph Chamberlain, which was to kind of illustrate that, yes, he was in fact a racist, and we're not just making this up for the exhibition. But we also had quotes from Malcolm X, Audre Lorde, and the president of Barbados to explore the topics of the environmental impact of colonialism, capitalism as a motivation for colonialism, representation, Joseph Chamberlain, Kenyan independence, Indian independence, guns in Birmingham, and the history of eugenics. So it was a heavy exhibition, a lot of deep topics. And the main thing that came about was the way we interpreted the exhibition, the language, the voice. It was very clear that this was written by people outside of the organization, and that it was speaking to people who felt disenfranchised. And we wanted to make a point of not putting these in quotation marks, but to have this as the museum voice in that space. We got a lot of pushback from it because people were really used to experiencing what they felt was a neutral voice throughout the museum, and they felt that this was a subjective voice, and that kind of brushed up against a lot of their ideas of ethics around museum practice. We had spaces in the gallery for people to speak to each other, and we had a really strong social media presence where people carried on this debate, and it ended up being a really influential exhibition. Now, in my new thinking around kind of decolonial practice, I really frame this as sort of a masculinized version of decolonial practice. When I want to compare it to other artists' practice, I think sort of Akala and his musical practice and how he uses so much context and information, but it's really about who has power and subverting that idea of power to challenge these ideas of, again, this mundanity of some of these spaces in replicating colonial violence. And it was really quite loud and aggressive in it. So a lot of people didn't find that the space was for them. It felt really polarizing to some. It felt really refreshing to others. The feedback was we didn't go too far enough. We didn't go far enough when we went too far. And that was sort of the energy of that space. But it was energized, it was energetic, and it did spur a lot of change and has influenced a lot of other practice since. There I am in the gallery with 3 of the co-curators, my boss at the time, and then another curator from the British Library. The exhibition that followed The Past Is Now was Within and Without Body Image and the Self. And this is one that I frame as a more femme version of decolonial practice, because this really was interrogating this idea of belonging and recentering. And again, when I want to mirror or share artists that I think this practice reminiscent of or was inspired by, I think of Janelle Monáe. I'm not sure why both of them are musicians, but they are. This exhibition was supposed to be about body image and absence of representation. There's a theme, as you can see in some of my practice. With this exhibition, we decided we wanted to tackle big issues and also the idea of multi-vocality. So we created multiple ways that you could experience the gallery. And again, this was co-curated. The first one was co-curated with curators who were paid an honorarium, and that created an interesting tension because they were underpaid for the amount of effort that they gave. But at the same time, they had this dynamic of paying or being paid for labor. Within this exhibition, they were volunteers who had their kind of food and travel paid for, and it became much more of like an experience or club engagement, and the energy was very different, and we didn't get the same sort of pushback that we did from working with the others. It's quite likely that it's because the first group were more vocal, but it could also be this dynamic of paying and the power that that creates. The different ways that people could experience this gallery were through this kind of empathy body trail that each of the collaborators, the core collaborators, created to go around the exhibition. So they picked an object that they thought represented them. They asked you to touch it, to have a think about a bit of story to kind of frame their body and their space, and then gave you an order in which to go around the gallery. And then they wrote their own personal interpretations. We had the orange labels, which were a storybook crafted by the engagement professional on this project that went around and told a story that she had imagined through connecting a few objects in the gallery. We kept white labels to seem as the typical museum labels, which told you mostly the title of the piece or what it was if it wasn't an art piece, who made it, when it was made, that sort of information. But we'd also include why it was selected and who chose it, because some of the elements were chosen by the co-curators and others were chosen by the curators to try and make sure that the exhibition had some sort of cohesion. So we were being really transparent about that. And then we had the burgundy labels, which explored the meaty topics that underpin some of these questions of erasure. So we had colorism, we had the male gaze, and we had queering as ideas. And then we commissioned photographic work to fill in the gaps for people that didn't exist in the space still. We had a lot of feedback that it was still quite an ableist exhibition, even though that was something that we had in our mind, because the only disabled person represented was not a body, but a chair and a leg. And so they were objectified to a literal level. And it was really interesting to work through that. There we are again in the exhibition. My next curatorial kind of engagement after Birmingham really was at the Horniman Museum and Gardens. Now, they had just redesigned their World Gallery, and it had been a long project working with a lot of different people from around the world to try to do the huge job of representing the world. And it was hugely successful in lots of ways. It uses a thematic approach and tries to think about the universal experiences that we all have, and the themes that they came up with were raising children, telling stories, remembering the dead, and celebrating life, and use these to be explored in each geographical area, and then created at the back a sort of perspectives wall where you could create your own connections to the space. Up on the balcony, they had the sort of background to the Horniman and the Horniman collection and Frederick Horniman. So what it was definitely an attempt at anti-racist practice within the museum. It fell short in some areas. So the Frederick Horniman's exhibition section specifically was not very critical of a tea merchant and his history and this sort of voyeurism around collecting, which was interestingly explored quite deeply in some of the engagement activities. And then, despite being in Forest Hill with a huge Caribbean community, there were no Caribbean narratives in the World Gallery at all. So one of the things that I wanted to do while I was there was create layers on top of this exhibition that allowed an idea of flexibility and criticality of this anti-racist approach with a decolonial lens. So understanding who was still missing, why was it laid out in this way, and this approach to individuals and people. It also had a lot of the elements of being for an unempathetic audience, but created by and with people that it was about. So it had some elements of great practice, that they were working collaboratively with people whose history was being represented. It did not suspend people in time. There was a lot of contemporary relevance and excitement, but it did feel very much like it was for people who didn't understand this culture. And there was a particular element on refugee narratives that felt quite painful if you were a person who had experienced that sort of displacement. It was about trying to humanize people by creating an alternate narrative to the one that mass media was making around what it is to be a refugee, which is very important. But it's not for a refugee to see that story. It's for others. And I have an interesting relationship with this idea of empathy building, because again, I feel like it really centers whiteness and this idea of non-empathy and education rather than communal care and survival and support. And then just to sort of bring this up to date, my latest exhibition that I worked on was with the Black Cultural Archives. And this was the second staging of their exhibition, Stories of Black Leadership 2. The first staging was done by Shasti Loden. And this was the second in two series, the second of a 3-series annual exhibition of portraits of significant women, Black women in Britain, and their achievements and and their stories. And the photographer, Joy Gregory, is amazing, and it was wonderful to work with. One of my big learning experiences from this was the different energy it takes to not start from an institution that starts from a point of whiteness as normality. Working with the Black Cultural Archives really challenged how much of that is embedded in a lot of our practice, and how once that is decentered and that shifts a lot more is possible with a lot less. The Black Cultural Archives is a huge amount of work with that very small budget. And so this was a really interesting and important moment. And it was also great to understand this sort of dynamic between art history, and archives. So the portraits that Joy took were based on National Gallery portraits and this idea of how to display power. And so she wanted to mimic some of the imagery, the posing, the lighting of these sorts of men of power and these white men of power, and placing Black women in these positions to show how significant and important they were. There I am again. So I want to end with some top tips, because hopefully this rambling presentation is useful for others who are trying to understand their career within heritage, art history, museums, etc. So my number one top tip is to remember to collaborate. Collaboration has sort of been the key to all of this. There's only so much that you know and can do on your own, and there is an energy that's created by working with other people. But ultimately, you need to be able to communicate. You need to be able to break down your practice so that other people can understand what it is you're doing, and not expect them to read your mind, particularly when you're collaborating. You need to be able to explain what it is that you're doing, why you think you're doing it, and when you don't know something. So this comes to the next point, which is to be humble. Humility is sort of the key to all of this, because museum spaces, as well as with all of the art, are struggling industries. There's a lot of funding that's not there, but it's hidden behind the grandeur of these spaces that were created at a different time with a different kind of budget. And all people outside of the industry see is the facade. We don't show them the struggle. We don't show them the unfinished piece. We don't show them the exhibition as it's being installed. We show it at the end after everything has been cleaned and put on the walls. And so we are being challenged by people who think we should be doing better and expecting us to have a lot more resources. And a lot of time, the thing that we don't do is admit that we're struggling, that we don't have as much money, and that maybe we don't have the confidence to do certain things on our own. Humility is really about listening and learning and adapting to others. So it's a key part of communicating, but it's something that cannot be underestimated enough. Don't let criticality go. The further you get away from education, sometimes the easier it can be to let criticality go. But it's important to stay self-reflective and to listen to others when they offer constructive criticism. But constructive is the key. It's working to create, to construct, to build. Build upon the work others have done, continue the legacy of work that you've done, build bridges, and dismantle barriers. It's not imagining that we're the first to do anything. It's acknowledging all of the work that's been done before and the work still to come. So appreciating our position in that as part of the construction. But this idea of dismantling barriers, I'll return to decolonizing, which can often be framed as a form of deconstruction or even destruction of a system that we have in place. Systems that many love and that many will defend, but it's about dismantling oppressive practices through creativity and communication and collaboration, building something new and better together that keeps elements that foster the sense of belonging, but that include more people in that feeling of belonging, and stops purposeful erasure and the subsequent ignorance that leaves many of us unrepresented or misrepresented and silenced by spaces that are meant to be for memory and exchange. So I would encourage you to explore decolonial practice if you haven't already. It's an important tool to work in spaces around memorialization, memory, and culture. But yeah, if you have any further questions, if you want to chat, please do get in touch. I love to hear from different people. My Twitter is there. And then my work at the National Archives is around inclusion and change. So I'm happy to help make this industry and archives more inclusive, more visible as a part of this process. So thank you very much. And I will hand over for the questions.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Rachel. That was absolutely fascinating. It was lovely to see the Sainsbury Centre in the background. Always a fantastic and perfect. So while we give people a couple of seconds to gather their thoughts for questions, I was going to ask if you kind of, the standard, if you could go back and change anything, do anything different, kind of give yourself any top tips, to your younger self, what would you change? What would you say?
So I don't know that I would change anything yet, but give me a couple years and maybe I'll make a different decision on that. But one of the best things I did was get business cards early, because if you're going to try and seize opportunities when they pop up, it's really great to have a business card on you, and it makes you seem more serious about what you're doing. And it gives you some sort of bravery to just hand your information to someone that might not seem like someone you should contact. But then on the flip side of the thing, I guess the thing I would do more is follow up on some of those connections made through business cards, because I have a collection of them now. And there's some people that I was like, oh, if I just contacted them straight away, I would have created, I didn't need to promise to do things for them. I just needed to make that just after the conference, let me just touch base. It was really nice to meet you. Basic level of communication. I would advise people to do that, because you can keep growing your network that way. And it just makes you more memorable than all the other people that handed a business card to that person on that conference.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Perfect. Do we have any more? Would you say, kind of, especially at the outset of your career, you know, when you were still kind of taking on opportunities alongside your studies, say, did you find it harder to ever say no? You know, say you were very, very busy. You already had, you know, projects, maybe an essay due for your masters and everything, but then there'd be a brilliant volunteering opportunity, but you also sort of knew you were a bit too busy. Did you find it hard to ever say no?
I still find it hard to say no. It's a skill that um, I really admire other people doing. I think it's something that, I mean, without subscribing to too many gender stereotypes, that women have a problem doing. And they always also say, you know, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. So if you're already that kind of person that's in that mode of the momentum that you're doing something and something else needs to be done, and it just builds momentum, you feel like you can do a lot. But I think I've already burnt out once in my career, and so it's important to keep track of that. I have a person that I now ask to tell me to say no, like regularly, just out of the blue. Just, it's okay to say no to something today. And it stops me actually a lot of the time from about to agree to something else that actually I could say no to it and it's fine to do so.
Yeah, I think it looks like Shimran's got her hand up virtually. Oh. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. That was a really fascinating talk and so insightful. I really found everything you were saying about decolonization and the idea of creating a sense of belonging rather than difference so powerful and so important. And it reminded me of Caroline's talk when she mentioned that there was a Sikh student who entered her class and saw a whitewash of artists and felt like they didn't belong. And it's so important to create that sense of community and inclusivity. And so I wanted to ask you, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that sometimes you feel like there is that imposter syndrome. I was wondering if you could tell me more about how you deal with it. I think that would really resonate and be an important part for our network.
I feel very passionately that it's important to name the feelings that you have. And I think imposter syndrome is a problematic term. And I think it's something that we do use a lot to explain this feeling of nervousness. But we do get it. And there's certain things that trigger it. So I use it because there's certain things that make me feel more of an imposter than others. And anytime I use art or art history, I get imposter syndrome immediately. I think there's a tendency to feel that if you want to call yourself an artist, you need to have been making yesterday and you plan to be making tomorrow, and you need to be exhibiting, and there needs to be this level of kind of production behind your practice to kind of make the name mean something. And then with art history, there's this feeling of status, and you know, you still haven't quite gotten all of the letters behind your name or these amount of years of practice, or you know, to justify feeling like you could speak to other people about it. And sort of when I name it, I can understand that it's a little bit unnecessary, and it's not real. Like I could talk to anybody down the street about our history if I wanted to, because I know about it, I'm interested in it, and actually anybody can talk to me about our history, and they don't need an entry level requirement of knowledge to have to engage with me in that conversation. I just sort of need to flip it a lot and know that I'd be happy to hear from anybody who's willing to talk to me about something that they're passionate about.
That's a really good point, and it takes away the idea of having to have an elevator pitch for one's research. Really important. Thank you so much. Really useful.
I did see that one of the questions was on studying abroad, and I didn't mention that, but I did study abroad during my undergraduate degree, and it was a really useful experience alongside all the other kind of international work that I've been trying to do. And what was the question? It said challenges. So studying abroad was really useful for me in that I again met new people and was working in a different context. I did 3 months in at the École des Beaux-Arts in Dijon as a part of my art history and art undergraduate. It was really hard to stay productive because I was really interested and excited by the culture I was around, and it seemed more important to experience the culture than it was to do my work, my university work. And so it was quite hard to keep that sort of motivation, but the work that I did create, when I did create it, was really interesting and surprising. And the way of teaching was different. I found it difficult when I came back to reacclimatize to my course and the people that had carried on while I had kind of absented myself and returned. But eventually that caught back up with itself. It was just sort of like a delayed experience. And then everything that I had undertaken while I was in France helped to build my practice. But anytime that you go abroad to do work in a different way, or at least I've experienced this, you feel a little bit unsettled, you feel that feeling of othering again, that you are different to everyone else, that maybe you don't speak right. Definitely in France, there's a lot of pressure to speak not only French, but French with the accent that they expect you to speak French with. So that is something to kind of overcome. And when I was in Haiti, I found it difficult to hear people that I came with framing the Caribbean as sort of something they were trying to unpack and learn about for the first time. So I was with a certain group of people, but feeling like I belonged to another group of people. And that was a really interesting kind of disconnect. And that's what made me long to go home and to work in not just the Caribbean, but also in my home country and see what the difference would be there.
Yeah. We have a question from an anonymous member of the audience. How have you handled precarity in the sector?
I've been pretty fortunate since my undergraduate degree and that internship that I did straight out of. So I graduated, and going to my final degree show was also the day for my interview for my internship. So I just wore the same dress, went to both. And then I started my internship a week later. So I didn't have really a gap between my undergraduate degree and working. And then when I was at my when I was doing my internship, I applied for the traineeship before that ended. And so I started that immediately after. And then the traineeship ran into another 6-month contract, and that ran into another 6-month contract after that, at which point I took a month off, and then I went and did my master's degree. And then before I finished my master's degree in Norwich, I had started working in Birmingham. So there was 2 weeks where I commuted between Birmingham and Norwich to finish my master's dissertation. And if you know the map of England, that's not an easy commute.
No.
And I was sleeping in hostels, and I was just basically doing anything to make it work because it felt like it was a good opportunity. And then that was an opportunity I had to take on as a freelancer. And so I was registered as self-employed from that point onwards. That ended up being a year and a month kind of 2 contracts. So first one was 6 months and the next one was 6 months for the 2 exhibitions. And then the contract ended and I didn't have a job for about, had about 3 months where I was just freelancing, doing kind of talks and some extra things. I had saved enough money, and by that point I was really in need of a break. So I went to Australia to see my friends, and I applied while I was in Australia for my job at the Horniman. The day I flew back from Australia was the day before my interview. So I went to the interview jet lagged, less than 24 hours after being in Australia, got that job, started pretty soon. And then a month before that contract ended as well, I applied for my job at the National Archives. And then I've been doing freelance jobs in between. So the precarity has influenced me in the way that it's kind of created this urgency to constantly apply for work, no matter what scenario I'm in, whether I'm relaxing or supposed to be switching off, whether I have a job, but it's only got 3 months left on the clock, whether or not I need to sleep in a hostel to get this opportunity to work. That's how it's influenced me. I don't think it's necessarily healthy. And I think that's indicative of a not very healthy institution, organization, industry. But my job at the National Archives is now permanent. So this is the first time I've had a job where I don't have to think about the moving house within a year. I've lived in so many different cities across England, and I've moved house in the last 10 years 12 times. So it's interesting because you have a different mindset as well. You're imagining building upon your own work rather than creating change really quickly. There's a lot of space to think about what the problem is in your institution, who can help, how do you plan for 3-4 years. So that's a different head, different hat. So it's I don't know if that's useful. I'm sure it's a lot of insight, but it's yeah, precarity is a real issue.
Yeah, it definitely is. Claire had asked, you mentioned having someone to ask. Is this a mentor, or do you feel that mentors are helpful if it's not sort of a particular individual? Or
yeah, I think mentors can be helpful. I've never had any official mentors, but I have a lot of unofficial mentors, I would say, that have helped me by sharing their practice, being really honest about their journey as well, but also having interest enough in you and your work as an individual to talk through the issues you're facing in multiple ways, but also passing on opportunities, particularly when you're freelance and you're looking to speak or to deliver workshops and stuff. Being well networked, but also having someone who has access to when projects are formed or about to be shared, to have your name floating, having your name and people like recognized enough that people will think of you to invite you to things is really a hard step to get to, but a really useful step to get to. That's when you start to build on your own momentum and generate. But I'm also a big advocate for getting to speaking to people who are completely outside of your industry to give you a sanity check about the things that we accept because they're so perennial as issues, versus things that are just not acceptable and we're accepting it, and that's wrong because we're also perpetuating a culture where some things that are unacceptable are being accepted.
Yes, no, I know exactly what you mean. You've only got a 38-hour contract, but also you're meant to be publishing alongside that. And yes, no, it's I think you're right. It's very important to get outside the echo chamber sometimes, and it can be productive for the subject, I think, as you say. Yeah, so. Does anyone have any further questions they'd like to raise before we sort of wrap things up for day one? Any of the other panelists or audience members? No? Okay, well, Rachel had put up her details if you do want to reach out with kind of any master plans for the future or kind of any questions. So yes, I'll sort of move on to closing remarks. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a fantastic keynote, and thank you for sharing your story with us. It's a fascinating journey, and it looks like it's going on even bigger. So enjoy.